Good day, everyone. This is Matt O'Grady joining you from London. I'm with Nielsen, and today we are presenting the Nielsen Global Media webinar for advertisers on the impact of COVID-19 and our playbook. This presentation today is designed to address the advertiser community. We're hosting another webinar tomorrow for the media sellers, but this is primarily meant for the advertisers and the media buyers. I'm your master of ceremonies today, and I'm joined by my two colleagues, Ranjit Langani, who's located in Dubai, and Michele Strezera, who's in Milan. So we truly have a global audience for you. So let's go to the next slide. Why are we hosting this webinar? We don't want to lose out on the opportunity to take advantage of the crisis in front of us. Every crisis, the flip side of it is an opportunity. And we at Nielsen are sitting on an enormous amount of data. We have a plethora of data that we collect. We measure TV in 36 markets and digital in 47 markets. We collect consumer spending data in over 100 markets. So we have a lot to pull from. We are behavioralists. We will tell you what people are actually doing, what they're watching, what they're listening to, what they're streaming, and what they're buying. Our business has been resilient, and it has surprised us how we're able to continue to collect our data remotely. And it is often the currency metrics in many of these markets, and we take that responsibility very seriously. But as I said, we are behavioralists. We're here to lay out the facts and show you what we're seeing. While we understand that it is likely that there will be a pullback in advertising, we believe this is an incredible responsibility for advertisers today. The large audiences that are being captured today are unprecedented. In many markets, we've seen increases upwards of 50%. So for those that continue to advertise and have means to do so, you will stand out in a crowd. When others go quiet, your voice will get louder. So our agenda is very straightforward and simple. Understanding the COVID anomaly. How are media behaviors changing and how are advertisers responding? We've seen these high levels of viewing periods in consumption in the past as well, but nothing as sustained as COVID has been. When we have high viewing, say around a sporting event like the Olympics, it lasts 2 weeks. You know, we're several months into this now, and we're still seeing very high levels of viewing. How long will it last? We're not entirely sure. And secondly, winning beyond the crisis. What will tomorrow look like? The themes that will define the media after the crisis will cover, as well as implications for that business. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our first presenter, Ranjit Langani, who's in Dubai. Ranjit?
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Matt. Good day, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. As Matt mentioned, in the first two sections of today's presentation, we're going to stay focused on summarizing the state of media today. So we're going to talk about how media looks during the current COVID crisis. I will start with how media behavior is changing in the current state, and then pass it on to my colleague Michele to overview the advertiser response. Page 5, please. Now, during my 17 years at Nielsen, I can't really think of any client presentation that has started with a quote from Lenin. But I thought this was a perfect metaphor for COVID's impact on media today. The current heightened state of media consumption will not be the new normal. However, COVID will serve as an accelerator towards greater digitization and greater consumer experimentation with media. Net, COVID is not a new normal in itself, but an accelerator to media's new normal. Next page, please, Chen. Now, the first change behavior you might expect from being indoor is expanded TV consumption. TV viewing has expanded due to a surge in news consumption, heightened kids viewing from being at home, and families using the TV set as a means to fight collective boredom. The growth, as you can see across different countries on this page, is not the same everywhere, but it generally hovers in the 30 to 40% range versus pre-COVID time periods. The bottom line here is TV as a medium has expanded in consumption broadly by about 30 to 40% around the world. Page 7, please. The other consistent theme is that the biggest jump in TV viewing is actually seen during non-prime hours. Again, as I mentioned, given that kids are home, we're seeing a surge in TV children's programming during the day. We're also seeing huge spikes in news and general entertainment viewing over the otherwise relatively smaller bases of the morning and afternoon day parts. Interestingly, as we look at change and track this COVID change versus previous periods, we are seeing limited upsides during prime hours, and that could be also because viewing fatigue sets in as people reach the evening after having been in front of the TV screen pretty much for the entire day. Now, TV viewing is considerably higher during the COVID crisis, and particularly higher in the non-prime hours. Next page, please, Jen. Now, this is a busy chart, but what we're looking at on this page is week-on-week viewing on the TV set across markets. And what we're really looking at in these bars is the actual average viewing time week on week. There are three broad messages I'd like to convey on this chart. The first one is that the TV viewing curve is shaped by the intensity and the timing of the lockdown. Notice how the US peaks as it goes into the lockdown, and contrast that with Sweden on the right, where there really wasn't a lockdown in place. And so you'll see Sweden is largely flat for many weeks during the COVID period. The second message is that viewing peaks and then flattens even during the lockdown as viewer fatigue sets in. The Philippines and Poland on this page are good examples where we see some uplift in viewing in the initial weeks and then a lot of flattening in the remaining weeks. Lastly, Korea is another exception on this page that I draw your attention to on the right, largely because Korea is one of the markets that went into COVID very early on. So it finds itself right now in the recovery life cycle, with essentially it being characterized by not just a flattening, but also eventually a dropping of viewing levels for TV in the last couple of weeks. We'll talk about, again, what the future of viewing looks like after COVID, but just bear that in mind because Korea is a good example of what might happen once the peak of COVID is behind us. Next page, please. The next big media consumption theme is the explosion of streaming. Now, what you're looking at on this page is the weekly view of streaming consumption of the latest 4 weeks versus the same period last year in the US. The most striking thing you might notice on this page is that the absolute number of streaming minutes has more than doubled in 2020 in the last 4 weeks versus the same period last year. Now, these levels are unprecedented. So to give you some context, in the last week in the US, on just one day, right, the 4th of April, one day alone, there were 27 billion minutes of streaming consumed in the US. That is 50,000 years of content in one day alone in the US. So again, these levels are unprecedented and are being accelerated, right, with people staying indoors. The other nuance here is that amongst the key players, we also see in the US a modest increase in the others bucket. The most notable recent launch in the US in the streaming space has been Disney+. And essentially the net message I want to convey here is that streaming is high and almost doubling versus last year, but also B, that the introduction of new streaming services has added to the strength of this streaming phenomenon. And again, the US is a great example of that. Next page, please. Now, we talked about linear TV, we talked about streaming on the TV glass. What we're also going to talk about is that overall digital consumption in the current COVID period has also grown considerably. On the left, we have some data from Australia. What you'll notice is that digital consumption in Australia grew 20 to 30% in March of 2020 versus in February of 2020. So in 1 month alone, on a month-on-month basis, digital consumption expanded by 20 to 30%. The other thing we noticed is that in smartphones, there was 40% growth in consumption, in content consumption, in March 20 versus March 2019. So again, on a year-on-year basis, in the month of March, consumption on smartphones expanded by 40%. On the right of this page is India. We have a smartphone panel that we track in India. And what we noticed there is that the time spent on smartphones grew by over 10% in week 4 of COVID versus the pre-COVID period in large urban cities in India. Net consumption is up on TV, as we saw in the previous charts, and in digital during the COVID period. Next page, please, Jen. Now, let me just unpack a little bit of how consumption is changing in the digital world. So, as you might imagine, apps and services that encouraged or supported an indoor lifestyle surged considerably. What we're seeing on the left here is some data from Japan, where we tracked entertainment or video apps on the smartphone, right? Prime Video, Hulu, Netflix, and even YouTube. And what we saw is that across Prime Video, Hulu, and Netflix, unique audiences were up 40 to 60%. We also saw that YouTube, which is reasonably very well penetrated in Japan, saw again its user base expand by about 20%. So again, we're seeing that a lot of these entertainment apps who again help you, kind of manage boredom while you're indoors, again saw a great surge. Over on the right, when we see Taiwan and over to Taiwan, what we found is that e-com and delivery services, as well as gaming apps, grew significantly in March 2020. And the key message on this page is, if you're an app that makes indoor life entertaining or convenient, you stood to gain from all the data that we saw in February and March. Next page, please, Chen. The final consumer behavior that was on full display during COVID was heavy leaning into social media. Now, across markets, the trajectory of social media activity had a great deal of consistency. Generally, social media got active within the first local case being reported in the news. It spiked at the time of the lockdown or when serious measures were put in place by the government, and then tapered off as cases flattened. What you see here on the page is the China example. But there are a lot of similarities between this graph and some of the other graphs in the initial few weeks of COVID. So Taiwan, as an example, peaked at a similar time. And Korea went through a similar trajectory, but peaked later in February. So again, similar trajectory, different times based on when COVID hit. The other thing I'll mention about social media is that we also saw that consumers first used social media as a conversation channel, right? A lot of discussion, a lot of questions. And then later, as COVID peaked and matured, we saw that it evolved more into an information and news channel. So how social media was used during the COVID crisis also evolved with time. Next page, please. Now, I will now hand over to my colleague and advertising intelligence expert, Mikel Strezera, to summarize the advertiser response during the current COVID anomaly. Over to you, Mikkel.
Thanks so much, Ranjit. And of course, good day to everyone, and thanks for being with us. Analyzing the advertising answer to this situation is we try to do it analyzing two sets of information. On one side, we try to analyze the ad spend trends across the world. On the other side, we go deeply into the content of the message to understand if there are trends, common trends that have been used by companies to react to this situation. And just to anticipate, I have to say that if I can use some body language, the reaction was very common and was basically can be summarized in, hey, hold on, what's going on here? I don't have visibility. If I don't have visibility, I pull the brake and let's see what's going on. This is a survey run by IAB in March 2020. There was 400 interviews to stakeholders in the media agencies and in advertising, so in companies buying advertising, show that 70% of the respondents, they already reassessed media budget in March, either pausing or going dark or significantly downsizing it. And 74%, so 3/4 of the respondents, they say, well, this crisis will be worse or even much worse than the previous one. So that's clear, was the perception, was a clear reaction. Next slide, please. That is clear from the reaction of the advertising market around the world. Let's take Hong Kong as a good example, because of course it was one of the first areas affected by the COVID. Hong Kong has a precedent in 2003 with the SARS crisis. That crisis lasted between February and July. And February and March, even when there were already cases in Hong Kong, the advertising trend was anyway going up compared to the previous year. Then we had minus 15% in April and May. And then in June, there was already the recovery of the market, and the market was going up again. Now, what we can see in Hong Kong, that after minus 10 in January, February and March went down dramatically up to minus 30. And probably April will be very much in line. So it's very steep and clear and immediate downsizing, and probably will last longer than the previous situation. Other markets in Asia experienced the same situation. Singapore, for example, other went a little bit smoother and they had a softer decline. Australia in March, for example, has a decline, but not so big. Probably something worse would be expected in April. But look at Europe, for example, or United States. After a very good month of February, with all markets basically going up or being flat, the downsizing of March was really steep and evident, especially in France and Spain with minus 30. I can say something more about Europe. Next slide, please. Looking at the number of ads broadcasted on TV from week 1 to week 16, so across between January and let's say beginning of mid of April, you can see how the lockdown decided by the government has dramatically impacted on the number of ads broadcasted on TV. You can see that after some lines which are very similar to the lines of the previous year, at a certain point after the decision lockdown, the number of ads aired are significantly going down immediate. That's something completely unprecedented, showing that actually before being a financial crisis, this has been a social impact. Being prevented from our freedom to going around has dramatically affected the whole environment. And in Europe, I think probably bigger than in Asia. If you move to the next slide, you can see that in Asia, of course, the situation of Hong Kong was, as we described before. Of course, Philippines has a big hit after the COVID. But if you look at the other country, and we took Thailand as an example, the impact was okay, was as expected. There was an impact, but not dramatic as in Europe. And to the point that even in Philippines, the first 3 weeks of March, in Indonesia, the first 3 weeks of March saw an increase of advertising. Please, next slide. I want to focus on another couple of important things about trend data. And one is the digital. So we don't have so much history about digital. Digital is a sort of newcomer, not very important, but a sort of newcomer at the moment in the world. We had a crisis in 2008 and 2009, the financial crisis, but actually at that time, digital was pretty little compared to the situation about. So we don't have a lot of history to help us. What we have seen, even based on our observation using our digital ad ratings product, which is all over the world, we have seen in March a decrease in impression. And we saw that a lot of small businesses, which are the spine of a big portion of the advertising in digital, of course, has been heavily affected by the crisis. So what we can foresee is that there will be a decrease in digital as well, probably lower than the traditional media. I would say probably 20-30% lower than the impact on traditional media, but for sure there will be a decrease, which is a news in a way for the digital world as well. But we also foresee that the recovery in the second part of the year will be quicker than the traditional media. Next slide, please. The other thing I want to mention about the data is the impact on the different industries, because not every industry has been affected in the same way. Some industries have been naturally pushed up by the situation, by the just the coincidence. So retailers, for example, had a lot to communicate, but the government had a lot to communicate. Personal services like delivery, for example, or even connection from home was heavily pushed by the situation. And of course, the home entertainment, as Ranjit said before, was pushed a lot, and there was a lot of battle on advertising about Netflix, Disney Plus, and Amazon Prime especially. Some industries, on the other side, they had a very inconsistent behavior. Let's take pharmaceutical is a good example. In Asia, they actually went up. The pharmaceutical had more as an increase in ad spend, because I think most of the materials were already available. But in Europe, for example, when I can take Italy as an example, when face mask and sanitizer went out of stock immediately, was not possible to find anywhere. Well, in that case, of course, the pharmaceutical was unable to communicate. Food communicated quite a lot. Household product, they communicate quite a lot. But for example, drink went down. And finance was also very inconsistent and not very straightforward in what they communicate. Of course, there are other sectors which are heavily affected by the crisis, like automotive and tourism. In general, and that's a nice graph from an India observation, a lot of essential ad volume of essential has been going down, while services and social have been pushed out. And social is actually a good word. Next slide, please, to bridge to the second part of the presentation, how advertiser has communicated to the people and to the consumers. What we can observe, that's an observation based on the top 5 countries in Europe, in Western Europe, that there was a huge increase of COVID-related ads during March. So taking the full amount of COVID-related ads in March, 60% was actually aired for the first time in the last week. So there was really an exponential growth, only 1% in the first week to 60% in the last week of March. And that went across all industries. Retail, of course, as a force. Retail changed completely some coping mechanisms. For example, making advertising try to help vulnerable people, changing opening hours and giving donation. Support to their employees, which together with the health services were the heroes because they were still there working. Education of people in terms of social distancing in the store, but also contactless payment to avoid exchange of and hand touch. And in general, try to give a sense of security and don't panic. Okay, we feel the chefs, don't worry, we will find what's needed. So retailer made a huge social impact and communication on that. Next slide, please. But coming from the previous research that we mentioned of AB, 65% of the respondents say that they were already changing their communication, going to more social-related marketing or more cause-related marketing. And we try to outline 3 trends that have been common across the different industries, to the point that sometimes you have even some difficulty to differentiate yourself because everybody went a little bit in this direction. First trend were charity, supporting our institution. We can see now donation of Unilever, though, for example, 100 million worth of materials, or Advertiser donating to the Red Cross, or HSBC Bank donating to the National Trust Services, or creating optional situation for employees, for example, giving free rides to people of national health services, or even free meals. So first step was donating, making charity. The second trend, please, next slide, was actually more focused on education, because there was a lot of support to be done by companies to educate people. Social distance, for example, was the first one. Some companies even modified their logo. Mercado Libre is an Argentinian company doing e-commerce. The logo is two hands shaking, and now they moved to two elbows touching to emphasize this social distance. Burger King changed the slogan. Even McDonald's in some logo separated the M. Actually, it's nice the communication of Hotels.com. Captain Obvious, the guy you can see with the red jacket, is the main character of the Hotels.com communication. Usually, Captain Obvious says to people, "Hey, don't stay on the couch. Just move away from the couch. Move away from social travel." And now he's saying, it's going to be socialism for a while. Don't worry, you know. Second element was education about especially washing hands, and that was really important, especially in some areas where probably washing hands is not a very common practice of the old days. So there was a lot of communication, especially by personal care companies to educate people in washing hands and take hands clean. Next slide, please. The third trend was actually helping people, helping consumers in different ways, of course. Some companies move, for example, to support customers in terms of helping them with finance, for example, issues like this French bank or even Ford trying to be more flexible on the payment on the installment. Some others created activity for kids to work to play from home, for example, Barclays, or even to spend your time in your hobbies, like Fender giving 3 weeks of free guitar courses. So trying to help people, trying to really get in touch with people. And the other one was reinventing their production chains, their manufacturing implants to cover products which are very needed. For example, fashion company like Prada moving to production of face masks, or Coty and Bacardi moving to producing sanitizer or face masks from IV as well. A lot of car companies moved, for example, to produce ventilators because, of course, of the technology. Next slide, please. One other, let's say, if I can make a small digression, one other element of reinventing the activity is given by sports. We can have probably titled this slide in a different way, saying starving for sports, especially when I saw a few days ago that the draft on NFL actually had 55 million of attendance virtually, which is a huge number, something unprecedented. There is a hunger for sports, and many sports have turned into esports, virtual sports, much more than before. Motorcycle, for example, or NASCAR and Formula One, football with a challenge between football player and esports player, and on FIFA, for example, but also sport that you didn't think before, like cycling. For example, there was a Tour of the Flanders, was a great classic in Europe, which was run by 30 racers from home, from a setup home. And so, for example, in these days, the tournament of tennis of Madrid is being broadcasted. Is this a trend that will continue in the future? Difficult to be sure, to be honest. It's probably when the live sports will come back again, this will go down definitely. But it was a very interesting and innovative way to keep the brands and the sponsor close to the consumer. Next slide, please. So as we have seen, the reaction of companies have been pretty much consistent and pretty much similar, to the point that, again, it was difficult at a certain point to differentiate. So a lot of companies went to charities, to education, to helping consumer. It was difficult to differentiate your message from the others. But now, the time is coming to get up again. If I look at the mentioning of COVID in social media, blogs, news, or forums in the third week of April compared to the previous week, there is a minus 20% of mentioning. So, and everybody is moving from, hey, we have to stay home, we have to stay separated, we have to stay far, to, okay, it's time to start again. Now, what we're doing next? So it's really time to start again. And that's the occasion, next slide, please, to differentiate. So if the message has been quite similar in the moment of lockdown, I think it's now time to differentiate and actually to stand up from the crowd. I can take 2 examples. Can you go back to the previous slide? Sorry, Jen. The previous slide, I took 2 examples from 2 industries that have been heavily affected. One was the previous slide. The automotive. The automotive, of course, had a big hit. But as you can see from this research run in China during the month of April from Ipsos, we can see that there will be a dramatic need of private transport in the future, because a lot of people will move from public transport to private transport. Not sure how we'll be helping our environmental, causes, But for sure, there will be needs of private transport. And the campaign of Jeep, when it's all over, will start to ride again. That's definitely got to the point. Next slide, please. Another sector that's been heavily affected is tourism, but we can see now some sign of recovery, small one, of course, because the situation of February was terrible. But in China, we can see, for example, in March, more hotel bookings and more flight also, taking off. It's a good sign. I would say that probably this year will be still a tough time for tourism for sure, and there will be domestic travel will be probably preferred to going abroad massively. So there will be a lot of return to the domestic flight. But I really like the campaign of the Portugal Tourist Board saying, hey, it's time to dream again. Amazing days will come. So let's move forward. And that's really the trend that we have to do now, and the company has to communicate. Let's move forward. Let's differentiate. Next slide, please. I terminate my speech with a summary of what Ranjit has said about media consumption and what I said about the reaction of advertisers. Media consumption, again, TV and digital consumption expanded significantly. Of course, there was a different distribution of the timing during the day, and definitely bigger than before. More technology, application and streaming devices, and social media became king, not only for talking to each other, but also to get news. And the advertiser response was in line. One thing is very important. There was no handbook. It was not clear how to do it. So gut reaction has been, everything was allowed in a certain way. So nobody made a mistake in that sense. Even, the advertiser went down. Many companies went dark. Now, getting dark is not usually a nice, an effective ways to react, because you lose a competitive advantage, you lose brand equity, you run the risk to be a little bit forgotten, and you need to take time to get back on track. So for sure, it's not probably the ideal decision, but there is no criticism here, because that was a normal reaction. Those who kept on communicated, they went on specific service because the service was naturally pushed on, or they tried to focus on the brand value, action and solidarity. The goal was trying to get a connection with consumers, now offering contribution and not specifically conversion, not performance marketing, but just closeness, with the idea that consumer will remember the brand that had been with them during that tough period. And again, now it's time to differentiate. Also having in mind in an important way that advertising has a social commitment, a social importance in modifying the perception of people. If everybody now move to hey, we have to start again, we have to go back to do the same thing, or more or less the same thing we did before, that will be the perception of the people. That's why I like to close my speech with a sentence taken by a nice ad from Guinness, which was broadcasted during the St. Patrick's Day, where of course it was not possible to party together, and they say, don't worry, we'll march again. Next slide, please. And now I'm passing over to my colleague Ranjit for the best what's next and the ad implication. Thank you so much.
Michele, thank you. And I wanted to apologize to the audience that we lost Michele's video feed there. That's one of the wonders of running a COVID webinar from home, where you're sharing Wi-Fi with your 6-year-old. So apologies for that. So Michele, thank you for the last advertiser response section. Now that we've looked at how consumers behaved and how advertisers responded, we'd like to paint a picture of tomorrow. And I'd like to start by outlining maybe 6 themes that will define media after the crisis through the end of 2020. And then I'd like to summarize implications for us for the buy side of media. The first key message is that recovery for the media market will be slow and heavily reliant on the interplay of several inflection points. So I'd like to start by maybe drawing your attention to the left-hand side of the page. I wanted to first start by giving you a sense of the changes in ad impression volume we track in China before, during, and after COVID. Now, keep in mind, these are digital impression volumes that Nielsen tracks in China. And the changes that you see on this page are 2020 relative to 2019. And as you can see, ad impressions before COVID were growing at about 20% in 2020 versus 2019. When the core pandemic hit, for that 30-day window, we saw digital impressions that we track in China fall by 69%. And then a recovery happened. The new growth rate in the 50 days after that core 30-day pandemic period was, again, growth, but in the single digits. And that gives you a sense of what that recovery kind of shape looks like. Now, if I draw your attention on the right, what I wanted to point out is that the nature and strength of the recovery, just like in China, in your markets will depend on a series of inflection points. Just to give you a couple of examples, right? When people go back to work or when people go back to school will dictate the recovery of the local print market and the out-of-home media market and the terrestrial radio markets, right? The reintroduction of live sports will influence, how many new sponsorship dollars come in, right? So there are several inflection points. We've listed out what we believe are the key inflection points. There's some interesting work that some of our colleagues in the US will release around this idea of inflection points in the coming few days. But the broad message is that the interplay of these inflection points will really dictate how fast of a recovery you see. Recoveries will look different by market. And again, the timing of these inflection points will play a role. Chen, next page, please. The second key message is that we expect most of the surge that we've seen in TV viewing in the COVID anomaly phase to settle back down based on what we've seen in the early markets like China and Korea. So what you're seeing here is, again, how TV viewing in China on the left and Korea on the right really peaked and then settled back down after COVID. TV viewing in these markets peaked just as the COVID curve flattened. So if I take Korea as a specific example, the maximum number of COVID cases in Korea was basically in the end of Feb. That's when it peaked. And consequently, we saw TV viewing peak the following week, the week commencing March 1. So there's a very close relationship between when COVID cases peak and TV viewing for a particular market peaks based on some of the early markets that we've seen so far. Chen, next page, please. The third message in terms of what media will look like in the future, at least looking at the rest of 2020, is that advertising demand will continue to stay pressured through the first half of the year. Again, this is some insight from the IAB with a US focus, but again, it provides some good insight of how advertisers are thinking. And essentially what it's telling us is, even through June, advertisers expect deep cuts. What's also interesting is that traditional media and outdoor media, those types of media actually are expected to be impacted the deepest, right? So it's going to continue to be a pressured advertising budget situation. We already know that cuts will be fairly deep until June. We will see some recovery, after that as well. But again, traditional and outdoor media types will continue to have a fairly tough year over the next few months at least. Next page, please, Chen. The fourth message looking ahead is that we will continue to see what we call a disequilibrium between audience demand and audience supply. And so essentially looking ahead, we will continue to see that audience supply will far exceed audience demand for much of 2020. Now, if you ask the question why, right, there are a few simple answers. Falling consumer incomes obviously leads to the falling consumer confidence and lower sales at the retail shelves. We also see that impacts business confidence. So we expect business confidence to stay tight over the next few months. And that obviously has a bearing on media budgets. So effectively, falling consumer income will drive lower, tighter business performance. And that will obviously mean that media budgets will continue to stay in check for at least the coming few months. Chen, next page, please. And all this means that, because of the disequilibrium between demand and supply, that both traditional and digital CPMs will continue to stay soft and try to counter that oversupply, right? It's the simple law of economics between demand and supply. When there is oversupply, right, prices get pressured. And so we're already seeing some reports of attractive and low record CPMs, but we continue to see continued pressure here. And what that means for advertisers and agencies, that you will continue to seek and get good deals from an advertiser perspective. Page 37, please, Chan. And you know, the other $1 million question that we get, and some of you asked this even in your kind of question requests as part of the webinar registration, is what behaviors will stay and what will go away, right? And again, this is not an easy question to answer, but the big message is that not all media behaviors we're seeing from consumers today during the anomaly will stay. We have to remember that much of these record viewing levels that we see during the COVID anomaly were directly related to forced time indoors. And so as lockdowns or restrictions come to an end, consumers will revert back to the old ways, but with some small changes. So essentially keeping the best parts of what they've experimented with, what they found to resonate most with them, but also sticking back to the old ways of working, right? So if I look at it as a consumer, I may watch more Netflix than what I did perhaps before COVID. I may video conference more with my family than perhaps what I did before COVID. But I will probably not watch 30% or 40% more TV only because I'm not going to have the luxury of having that much time indoors, right? Or I'm not going to stop listening to radio, right, in my drive to work because I didn't do that during the COVID period. So again, not all media behaviors will stay, but some, right, will stick based on what they've enjoyed in terms of their experimentation. Now, I wanted to talk about this in the context of, you know, who will have a great year because of this and who will have maybe a tough year, right, looking ahead. So it'll be particularly a great year for those media solutions that expanded the trial base during COVID, right? A lot of these media solutions really expanded their trial base by millions and some by hundreds of millions, right, around the world. And then it'll be a particularly tough year for traditional and outdoor-based media, at least for the coming few months, right, as budgets stay constricted. And any media really heavily reliant on small business ad sales, primarily because small businesses will need some time to recover from the economic damage of COVID. Chen, next page, please. So now let's look at what these new themes in media mean for your business. What I'd like to do is now outline 6 implications as food for thought for your business. Next page, please, Chen. Now, the first implication is really, you know, buying media as you would buy in the stock market, right? And essentially what that means is the best time to buy or shop the market is really when it's flush with great deals. So if you think about what characterizes, you know, the situation right now and into the future, you're getting great CPMs and great value, right, for media owners. You can be much more focused with your media mix because we know when people are indoors, at least for those periods, there's very little focus you need to have on out of home or movie theaters or terrestrial radio. And advertising when your competitors are absent, I think Matt touched upon this at the start, right? When your competitors are absent, that's really when you get more bang for the buck because your message goes further, right? It potentially resonates more because you have more share of voice. The net bottom line of the first implication is you should really be ideally erring on the side of investing more in the media market and not less at this time. In the second implication, I'd like to talk about, you know, how some advertisers during the COVID period really responded with a cookie cutter approach. And sorry, if we can stick back. Yes, thank you. So a lot of advertisers really stuck with a cookie cutter approach. Now, Michele showed us dozens of examples of good advertising during the COVID. But for every good advertising, there were dozens and dozens of brands that really did a very generic response to COVID, right? A lot of, you know, these are unprecedented times and we're with you. And then there were thousands of companies, you know, who had CEOs firing off pretty much the same templated letter to all consumers. It was almost as if the same PR company consulted with all 1,000 of those CEOs, right? And essentially, I guess the message I want to drive is, while I realize that COVID did not come with any playbook, right? And obviously, when you don't have a playbook, it's easy to play it safe and not take too many risks. But this was really a crisis time is really a time when you want to let your brand personality really play out and stand out in front of consumers. So the second big implication is if you still have, right, a response being framed out, try and stay away from a generic response. Try and really understand what your brand stands for and how that can shape your response, either during or right after COVID. Next page, please, Chen. Now, I'm big on quotes, so I'll give you another quote, right? And this is from Mike Tyson, who, almost once famously said, when, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And one of COVID's most attractive silver linings is the fact that it gives companies license to improvise and really think outside the box, right? So this is almost a once in a generation challenge for us to really think about how work is to be done, why you should advertise the way you do, and who you should be working with, right? So just looking at a couple of really good examples of how traditional unusual allies, right, came together. A good example of that is Apple and Google really coming together during COVID to really partner on contact tracing. And that's, again, one example of many good examples. The fourth implication is really brands that relied during COVID on the consumer walking through the door to touch and feel their product before buying them really got a wake-up call, right? And the example I like to give here is, that of Carvana in the US. So Carvana was an industry disruptor who in 2018, entered the used car retailing industry in the US. And basically, they were a tech company that started selling cars online. And what they did is they deliver those cars. So you could almost virtually pick what car you want and scan what's good about your car and see if that works for you. And then you could get them to deliver it either through, at your door or through one of their many car vending machines in the US. And that's, again, just one example of the litmus test you should be really testing your business with is, could my business survive if the consumer rarely left home, right? And that doesn't matter if you're an auto company or an insurance company or a food product, right? You really have to ask that question. Next page, please. So the fifth implication for advertisers and agencies is that you will have the responsibility of really voting with your pocketbooks after the crisis. As really who you vote for and who you support with your media dollars will really dictate who survives and who dominates the media landscape going forward. So just to give you a couple of examples, if you want your local publishers to survive, if you want your local radio stations to survive, and if you want them to make it after COVID, they will need you to lean in very quickly with your ad dollars. So the bottom line implication is your choices will have big consequences. So support and shape the media landscape wisely, because again, how you pay after COVID will really shape that landscape. And finally, I wanted to just close by saying that we also have an opportunity to reorient creatives, programming choices, and our messaging based on how consumer tastes have evolved after COVID. So as one example, our Nielsen's Basis team did some sentiment research very recently across 14 countries and found that in a world after COVID, consumers are actually willing to pay a premium, even mid to long term after the crisis, for themes around trust, quality, and immunity support. So those are just some cues that you have to keep in mind as you think about what your offering, messaging, and creative looks like after COVID, as there will be some true shifts in consumer preference given the crisis. So those were really our 6 implications. Again, we hope those implications give you at least a few things to think about. As we transition to the next slide, I'd like to hand it over back to Matt to bring us home. Matt, over to you.
Thank you, Ranjit. You and Michele covered an awful lot of content there, and hopefully I'll be able to summarize it in one slide. This particular slide, which has a lot of text on it, will be a leave behind. We'll be distributing this to everybody and emailing it to everybody who attended. But clearly, there are some pros that I want to call out. First of all, we have very high media viewing from very engaged audiences and demos that we didn't always, demographics that didn't always attract. So younger audiences we see are watching local news and not just relying on streaming for their services. So that's a very interesting phenomenon. They're engaged viewers, it's a wider audience, and also, as Ranjit was saying, it's a very attractive buy right now. Both broadcast, linear, radio, digital, everything, all the CPMs are very attractive in this environment, and thus you can capture a much wider audience. The cons are numerous. We know those. I don't need to drive them home, but there will be an impending recession post-COVID. You know, the drop in consumer confidence is already evident. And some of our media outlets, out of home, cinema, will have significant challenges going forward. And obviously, advertising budgets are under enormous pressure. But our message to you is if you can afford to advertise today, there's certainly great venues and vehicles and creatives that you can undertake and be successful with. So in conclusion, number one, the slow recovery throughout 2020 will vary by region. We'll probably see a faster recovery in the East and then head west as, you know, as it traveled and reflected the rate of infection. Number two, we're not going to go back to business as normal. We're going to be continually digitized, and the media landscape will be a digital media landscape, creating many new digital touch points. And this means video as well. This means not only linear video, this also means connected TV, over the top, streaming services that are either subscription or ad supported. And podcasts in the audio realm, we're seeing an enormous amount of podcasting going on. And in print, you know, the print subscriptions to traditional newspapers and magazines are up as well. So that could be the new normal, you know, going forward. But we encourage you to create these virtual and digital bridges with your consumers, with your customer, with your viewers, with your shoppers, with your audience. And regarding creative, Michele gave you several examples of how creative can work to your advantage in this environment. And initially, people were very concerned and very afraid to advertise, particularly in local news, next to any COVID news. But COVID was the only news that was out there. And thus you risk missing that large audience, or you risk the taboo of not wanting your brand associated, you know, with COVID-related news. I think much has been said about that and much has been dispelled, and much can be advertised appropriately with compassion, with concern, with connection and effectiveness next to COVID-related news. So now is the time to reinvent your business. We thank you very much for joining us today. We hope our data and our insights were helpful. And if we can be any further assistance, if you have any further questions, we didn't see any come in through the chat box, you can email us through the invite, or you can contact your local Nielsen representative, and we'll be happy to follow up with you. We thank you again for joining us, and I thank you, Ranjit and Michele, for your very profound and interesting and deep insights. Have a wonderful day.